Support for WMFE comes from JustCallMo.com and attorney Mo DeWitt, proud presenter of WMFE's Engage program. Mo DeWitt is committed to offering legal guidance in personal injury cases, such as car accidents and slip and falls. Offices in Orlando. More at JustCallMo.com.
Property squatters always existed in gray areas and legal loopholes.
How is this legal? I don't know how they got into my property. They changed the locks, they broke the window, and they still have rights to be there until I go through the civil procedure to get them removed.
A new law will make it easier for property owners to vacate unauthorized residence. Also, Orlando City Commissioner Regina Hill was arrested earlier today on charges of elder abuse. And later, Mr. Rogers has defined children's television programming for more than 50 years. A celebration in Winter Park acknowledges his contributions to children's education.
Fred Rogers wanted to make a program that would help children and families, and that's what he did. And that was his mission, to create as best of a program that he could.
I'm Sharon Stone. That's all ahead on today's edition of Engage. First, the news from NPR.
Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Engage is made possible with the support of inaugural sponsor, JustCallMo.com, and the support of listeners like you.
You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, Governor DeSantis was in town yesterday to sign an anti-squatting bill into law. And we will look at what the Rollins College neighborhood meant to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. First, though, longtime community leader Regina Hill is facing charges for elderly abuse and fraud. The Orlando District 5 commissioner was arrested just earlier today. WMFE Assistant News Director Brendan Byrne joins us now live with the information just revealed by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So, Brendan, what did you learn from their press conference held less than an hour ago now?
We learned a little bit more about the indictment, which, as you mentioned, were 7 charges. These are 3 charges of elderly abuse and 4 counts of fraud. And they stem from allegations of the mistreatment of a 96-year-old constituent. We mentioned WMFE's not naming the victim, who is a Paramore resident, who, according to court filings, has a cognitive disability. So last hour, the FDLE outlined the more than year-long investigation. They allege that Hill met the victim after she was made aware she was living in deplorable conditions. Commissioner Hill obtained a power of attorney, and through that, purchased a home in the victim's name, lived at one of her vacant residences, used the victim's money to renovate it while she was living in it, and the victim remained in those deplorable conditions, and then misused the power over the victim's bank account for personal purchases. They outlined things like hotel stays, car rentals, even a facelift. This came after extensive investigation of more than a year. They looked at financial records and interviews. The FDLE does not believe that there are any more victims in this particular case, but the investigation is still ongoing.
So what happens now? What is next, Brendan?
So Hill pleaded not guilty to the charges this afternoon at a court hearing. She's expected to be released. The conditions of her bond include not staying at the properties mentioned in the investigation, including others, not accessing any of those financial accounts, and, of course, not having any contact with the victim.
And Hill is a city commissioner. Have we heard any kind of response from the mayor?
We reached out to the city this morning, and they said that they have been made aware that Commissioner Hill had been arrested and charged, but the city does not have any authority to discipline an elected official, including suspending them from office. That power lies within the governor. Now, if the governor suspends Hill from office, pursuant to the city's charter, the city says they'll work with the supervisor of elections to hold a special election to temporarily fill the District 5 City Commission seat. That will happen rather quickly. I believe it has to happen within 45 days. We did mention that Governor DeSantis said yesterday that he was aware of the investigation. He was waiting on an indictment, and now that indictment is here, we're waiting to see if the governor will take action in this case.
WMFE Assistant News Director Brendan Byrne, thank you for updating us on this developing story.
Of course.
this does highlight another issue that we should be paying attention to. The AARP focuses on preventing this type of fraud and exploitation. Karen Murillo is a former prosecutor with the Florida Attorney General Office and is now an advocacy manager with the state's AARP. She joins Engage to discuss warning signs and resources available to help people really at any age. And I started the conversation by asking if the state has pushed for increased penalties in cases involving elderly exploitation and fraud.
The state of Florida has absolutely been increasing the protections and penalties when it comes to fraud and exploitation cases committed against older or vulnerable adults. So we're steadily increasing and improving those and have been for at least the past 15 to 20 years.
Karen, could you share some just red flags of potential exploitation that might be happening that people should be aware of?
Absolutely. So one of the number one red flags of exploitation or any form of abuse is going to be social isolation and maybe even physical isolation of a loved one from friends and family. Often that is how a person takes advantage in quiet and without anybody noticing what's going on. Another warning sign or thing to just be aware of, if a new person shows up in your loved one's life, they have a sudden new best friend or helper, somebody who they rely on a lot and spend a lot of time with, keep that in mind. If there are major changes to financial or legal documents, that's another telltale sign of financial exploitation. And if their banking activity or money management changes over time, that's another sign that exploitation could be going on. Finally, with many exploitation cases, as money is drained from a victim's account, we see a lot of checks bouncing, unpaid bills, other things that show that abnormal banking activity is going on.
What do you say to people who may think, they're just helpless to prevent something like this from happening to someone they care about?
We're not helpless. And that goes for family members and loved ones, as well as the people who are potentially victims or prospective victims of exploitation themselves. We have a lot of different tools that we can put in place to protect ourselves from exploitation going forward. And that can range from having a power of attorney with somebody who you trust, having a healthcare surrogate, again, somebody who you can trust well before you would ever need to rely on either of those. If you need assistance with financial planning or paying bills or anything along those lines, finding somebody who is a trusted and trustworthy financial advisor. I would say that the other big factor for all of us is keeping in mind that social isolation is that warning sign of exploitation or abuse. So making sure that we're staying connected with loved ones is a crucial part of preventing exploitation, or at least catching it before it can become hugely problematic.
And are there any challenges that you encounter with your work at AARP to protect vulnerable people from financial exploitation that you have, that maybe you want to work on moving forward or would like to see change?
AARP's Fraud Watch Network has actually been spending a lot of time focusing on how we talk to and about victims of fraud and exploitation, and really changing the narrative around fraud victimization. There tends to be a lot of self-blame or saying things like, oh, he or she fell for this, or I can't believe that they would get duped into something. And it places the onus or the blame on the victim, when in reality, this is somebody who is manipulative and gained their trust, who ingratiated themselves, who is taking advantage of a loved one. And so we need to be careful about how we talk about fraud and exploitation, because it does send a message that maybe if I report something, I'm going to be judged for it.
Karen Murillo is an advocacy manager with Florida AARP, and they have a free Fraud Watch Network helpline. We're going to get that information up on our website so you can access it. That is WMFE.org. Now let's turn to the latest on Orlando District 5 Commissioner Regina Hill, who, as we mentioned, was arrested earlier today on charges of elderly abuse and fraud. We have our Assistant News Director, Brendan Byrne, back live on the line now. So, Brendan, what did you learn from the press conference held earlier? Ahead here on Engage, a bill reducing squatters' rights was signed into law yesterday. We'll find out what that means for property owners and housing advocates. And later, we visit one of the most famous neighborhoods in America. I'm Sharon Stone. You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, Central Florida communities are hosting a week-long celebration of kindness inspired by America's favorite children's show pioneer.
He had the ability to almost teach in parables, and he also was as funny as could be. But you would never see that. That was not his role in the Mr. Rogers.
We will learn about Mr. Rogers' Week of Kindness and the man's legacy at his alma mater, Rollins College. Right now, though, Governor DeSantis was in Orlando yesterday to sign into law policies that would make it easier to remove squatters from properties they are occupying. There are loopholes in Florida real estate law that allow people under very specific conditions to occupy unused or abandoned property. Squatting has been in a gray area in property law. DeSantis explained his perspective of squatters' rights at yesterday's press conference.
This idea of squatting, when you had the Old West and people would settle the West, you'd show up, there'd be a place, so people would settle. They'd create a community. Well, to have someone come 7, 8 years later and say they own the property after all this, you understood why, that was done in that way. That was never intended to empower somebody to just invade some residential subdivision and illegally occupy somebody's private residence.
The new law was passed unanimously. It allows property owners to call police to remove people illegally occupying homes and businesses, and it codifies criminal charges for people accused of squatting. Rachel Alvarez is a real estate attorney in Orlando, and she has dealt with many clients with complaints about squatters. She joined Engage along with Florida property owner Jeremy Akins to talk about the impact of unauthorized residents. Alvarez started the conversation with the legal definition of squatting.
A squatter is someone who possesses a property unlawfully. In other words, they don't have a right to be there. They don't have any contractual obligation. There is no interaction with the owner. They just took over that spot.
Help me understand how that is possible. How can I just take over a place that isn't mine?
Well, there's a lot of ways that people get to do that. Oftentimes we'll find that tenants will have roommates that they didn't tell the landlord about. So the tenant will move out and then the roommate won't. So the landlord's like, who are you? And so that's how we get a squatter. We have also in Florida a lot of absentee landlords. So they'll have the property there vacant, thinking it's still vacant. Somebody who's a squatter, there's professional squatters out there, will go around looking for vacant property, and then they take residence on it. They start calling and putting the lights on, the water on, and they just make themselves really comfortable.
So they're paying bills, they're just not paying rent?
Exactly. So some of them even pay taxes. So that creates a whole other legal issue. Like we have adverse possession in the state of Florida. We could talk about that later, but essentially you can set some type of precedent where you're establishing residence on here. If you're paying taxes and insurance, you could potentially keep the property after a certain period of time.
As an attorney, what are some of the complaints that you've gotten from property owners dealing with squatters who I guess then can't get rid of them?
Well, the biggest complaint is, how is this legal? I don't know how they got into my property. They changed the locks, they broke the window, and they still have rights to be there until I go through the civil procedure to get them removed. So that's been one of the biggest complaints, because you have a lot of investors as well that will have properties, and then they go and have the management company come by, and then there's somebody living there. And it's like, okay, well, now we have to deal with this problem. Although we don't have a contractual agreement with them or any type of relationship, we'll have to go ahead and do this legal process, which is time consuming and costly to the landlords.
Can we talk more about that cost and time? It's an expensive process.
Yeah, so to do an eviction for a regular tenant, you're paying like about $185 to the filing fee. But to do an unlawful detainer, it's approximately $400. So you're telling the court, hey, I need this person removed immediately, but I have to get this document so that the sheriff will get a writ of possession to remove them. And so that procedure, it's not as long as an eviction, but it's more costly than an eviction.
Okay, we're speaking with attorney Rachel Alvarez. So why can't police just remove someone from trespassing then?
Because you have people that will do a couple of things. And I think it's very interesting. You'll have people who are either lovers who are now broken up and one person doesn't want to leave. And so now they have established some type of relationship with the person that's possessing the property. You also have people who say, oh, I have a lease, and they'll bring this documentation, or they'll even say that they're the owners and they'll have a deed that they recorded. And one of the biggest issues that we're now having in Florida is these fraudulent deeds that are being drafted, because we're public records, everything's out in the open. So everybody knows who owns what property, and they can go in there and fraudulently file a deed and say that they're the owners. So now you have a whole other issue in itself, and the unlawful detainer comes into place. But now we have to establish that that person's not actually the owner.
In addition to the property owner, are there impacts to the community in general, perhaps in terms of property value?
Well, oftentimes you'll see that the squatters usually don't take care of the property. About 90% of the time, they either have that or they'll have a bunch of people living in the property. And then, of course, if you're in an HOA, you have other issues because now you're in violation of the HOA, but this is somebody that doesn't even pay you rent. And now you have to deal with the HOA as the landlord. The rest of the neighbors are dealing with these issues because since they're not there lawfully, they're not going to comply with what the HOA regulations are. Typically, when people buy with an HOA, they want to make sure that it's uniform and it looks pretty and everything's maintained and kept. But if you have these squatters in there, they're not obligated to abide by the HOA. So they do whatever they want. So yeah, it does affect some of the property value. It also does disrupt some of the neighborhoods, depending on what kind of activity is done in those places.
Do you anticipate any impact of the law that DeSantis signed to make it easier for property owners to remove unauthorized residents?
So I would say that it's going to be a very interesting rule. As an attorney, I appreciate it because I deal with a lot of investors. So my investors are going to love this law. However, I think there's going to be a lot of fine lines because we do have some people that do make verbal agreements with each other to live in a property. So now we have to establish that person is not allowed to be there. And then we have landlord-tenant issues that we might run into. But according to what is proposed in the law, or what was proposed, is that it will also create criminal sanctions. So you have misdemeanors and like a second-degree felony, a first-degree felony. There's just so many other things to it, but it does make it easier for the property owner to be able to get this person, an unlawful person, out of the property. So I think that law is going to be great to prevent scams, or at least put some barriers in place so that we don't get scammed as much. But I think there's going to be a little bit of fine tuning we're going to have to get through.
And let's talk to a property owner now, and someone you worked with, Jeremy Akins, also joining us. So Jeremy, talk to us about your experience as a homeowner.
Yes, ma'am. So when I acquired the property through my mom's probate because she had passed away, there was my brother that was in the house unlawfully, along with a host of people that he had basically living here. I'm not sure if he was, charging them rent, but it was all illegal. So when we got to the part where I was able to take possession of the house and I received the deed from the probate court, I asked Miss, Alvarez if she could help me get my brother and whoever he had out of the house. And I didn't know that the process would be as intensive as it was. So she had to, prepare the unlawful detainer paperwork. I had to come out here and basically put a note on the door to let them know that they weren't supposed to be here, which I thought was a little crazy. We filed the paperwork with the court. And then once I filed it, I had to take the paperwork to the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. I had to pay them also with the filing fees and the attorney fees to come out here to serve the people that were in the home. And then once they were properly served, we still had to give them like 5 days to respond to the unlawful detainer complaint, which was another crazy thing for me. And of course, in my situation, they did respond. They had to set a court date, which, drug it out for, I guess, like another week and a half. And then once we had the court date, my brother was able to give his stance. The other people that was in the home didn't show up for the appearance. And then I was able to let them know, that I had the property. I had to show them proof. And once I did that, the judge was able to grant me possession, if I'm saying that correctly, of the property. But I was granted possession that day, but I still had to go back to the Escambia County Sheriff's Office and pay them more to come out to evict the people that were in the home. So it was quite a lengthy process for a situation where you think you could just get them out, in a day or two, just like someone broke in your house, like you could just get them out immediately and not have to bear the expense of, going through all of the channels in the city.
What do you think this has cost you in terms of money and time and maybe just emotionally too?
I think it's been a lot of money with the probate. I wasn't expecting to pay to kick them out. So that was kind of a, blow for me, especially going through like the probate process. So it was more of an emotional burden, like, why am I having to do all this? It seems like the people that are doing all the wrong are always protected. So I think it was more of a thing like, I'm doing right and everyone else is doing wrong. And why are they, why do they have legal protection, basically? That was my whole thing.
Jeremy Akins owns property in Pensacola. Rachel Alvarez is an attorney in Winter Park. The anti-squatting law may have some unintended consequences. Cynthia Laurent is a housing justice campaigner with Florida Rising, a statewide nonprofit that advocates for affordable housing and community equality. The organization is holding a neutral position on the signing of the law, but there is concern there is room for exploitation. Laurent joined Engage to articulate concerns about this bill that lawmakers may not have anticipated.
We know that there's been an increase of scams where folks believe that they're entering into like a lawful lease agreement, but instead it's someone who has created a false lease agreement, who even has access to the property sometimes. And so our concern is that people who probably entered into a lease thinking that it was a real agreement, now they can face criminal charges.
Is that something that you've had to deal with?
As an organization, we have not had to deal with it. However, we've spoken to people who've had that experience. And there was even testimony at the committee hearing where folks were sharing how they've been deceived by listings and Craigslist and other places.
Are you hearing anything from advocates within fair housing organizations about this new law?
Well, as a position that we do have on the new law is the potential of folks being disproportionately criminalized for perhaps just residing in a place unlawfully for a day. Because we know, like with this new law, folks can face a second-degree felony charge, which comes with up to 15 years imprisonment. That creates an additional barrier to access housing in a market that's already very limited with housing options, and especially affordable housing options.
Cynthia, am I hearing you say that the primary concern is residents who don't realize they got themselves in this situation? Or are you worried about landlords who are going to see this as an opportunity to maybe get rid of a tenant that they shouldn't?
Well, we actually are concerned about all of those things, but primarily we're concerned about landlords using this predatorily. And so because the process is so expedited, if a landlord wants to make a false claim against a tenant, say they were there unlawfully, by the time the sheriff comes there, the sheriff is just faced with evicting a person quickly and making that decision on their own. So the tenant then has to find their lease and provide that proof in such a short period of time, not knowing that this was a situation that would come up.
Can you speak more to our audience about, why should Floridians be sympathetic to the rights of people inhabiting these properties without authorization?
The position is not that people should be sympathetic to folks who are occupying without authorization. The position is that there are many people who are occupying with believed authorization, and then there are folks who actually have the right to be at the property, but they're being preyed upon wrongfully by their landlord. And so because this is such an expedited process, folks won't even have the time to prove that they have the right to be at the said property or they have a rightful lease. And what we know is that while they have a provision within the statute that says that folks will have a right to sue if they're wrongfully evicted through this process, we know that a lot of our community members just don't have access or funds in order to be able to get an attorney to sue for these types of wrongful evictions. It's a powerful tool, but it's a tool that we know a lot of working class people just don't have the ability to take advantage of. And so our concern is that landlords who are looking to make greater profit on their units will use this tool in a harmful way.
And Cynthia, now that this law exists, what will you or Florida Rising do moving forward?
Well, what we continue to do in all of the housing bills that are passed each legislative session is we continue to inform our members, through political education, about what bills have passed and how they may or may not impact them or the people that they love. And so our goal is, one, doing political education, and to continue to do advocacy with the senators, with the representatives, on how the real life implications of these bills may be harmful to communities, especially working class communities and Black and Brown communities that really just don't have the opportunity to bring a wrongful eviction suit against the landlord who preyed against them. I think another extremely important thing to keep an eye on is all of the folks who are renting from motels in Central Florida. We know that there is a large number of folks who can't afford traditional leases who rent from motels. And so they are particularly vulnerable to this statute because they don't have the traditional 1-year lease like other folks would have. And we know that the statute included if a person has an oral lease, but there's still the concern of how do you prove that in real time when a sheriff shows up to evict you? Just that expedited process alone and the fact that there are people without these traditional leases makes the population extremely vulnerable. So our hope is that this isn't abused, but we know there will likely be bad actors who abuse it. And our concern is that this will continue to funnel people into the pipeline of homelessness. And we already know that homelessness is being criminalized.
Cynthia Laurent is a housing justice campaigner with Florida Rising. Well, few images were as impressionable to Gen Xers and millennials as that of Fred Rogers walking through that door of his make-believe home every day, changing from loafers to sneakers, donning a cardigan to begin what was to be 30 minutes of safe, soothing preschool instruction. This was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?
Few viewers knew of Mr. Rogers' extensive ties to the Winter Park community. Fred Rogers graduated from Rollins College in 1951, magna cum laude, with a degree in music. His legacy there has endured. In 2021, a 3,000-pound bronze sculpture was unveiled on the Rollins campus of Mr. Rogers doing his favorite thing in the world, communicating with children. His passing in 2003 was mourned worldwide. His wife, Joanne, followed in 2021. Well, next week, Buena Vista Events and Management is producing 5 days of events that commemorate Fred and Joanne Rogers' contributions to children, and more broadly, to kindness and civility, hallmarks of the man's identity. Mr. Rogers' Week of Kindness will feature music, roundtable discussions, and Q&As with former cast members, faculty, clergy, and friends of Fred and Joanne. John Sinclair is a professor of music at Rollins. He was also a close personal friend of the Rogers going back into the 90s. He joined us to talk about the legacy of Mr. Rogers on the Rollins campus. He started by explaining how he first met Mr. Rogers.
Fred's, as you know, is an alum of Rollins College. And President Rita Bornstein was having him give a speech, and she happened to be going out of town. So she asked me if I would introduce him. I had met him, but really just in passing. So I worked on my introduction. After the end of the introduction, I said, "Welcome back to your neighborhood, Mr. Rogers." The next morning, I got one of his telltale in his very distinctive handwriting notes underneath my door from Family Communications. "Thanks for the introduction. Let's have lunch." And we became dear friends.
Is he who we saw on TV? You knew him.
He is exactly who you saw on TV, but more. On TV, he wrote the scripts very carefully, and he was very scripted. But outside, he had the ability to almost teach in parables. And he also was as funny as could be. But you would never see that. That was not his role in the Mr. Rogers. He could be whimsical. For example, he would come to our house and have face-making contests with my children. One time he left a tie. It was, I believe it was Mozart's birthday, and there was a tie on my door, an ugly, ugly tie of composers' faces. And it said, "Happy Mozart's birthday." And of course, the next major composer's birthday that came up, I sent it back and said, "It's way too lovely for me to have. I must return it." I bet we exchanged that thing over and over. He was witty, and he was so quick on his feet. I remember my son running up and making a Power Ranger pose. And Fred said, "Taylor, what is that?" He said, "I'm a Power Ranger." Well, Fred always got down on his knees to talk to the kids. So he got down on his knees and he pointed to his chest and he said, "Really, Taylor, the power's in there."
Oh, wow.
And he was that truly, truly kind heart. I know my son was a little afraid of going to all the noise of concerts. So Fred took him to his first concert, sat at the back of one of my concerts and held his hand. So he was truly that gentle soul that loved children, loved people, and had the curiosity of a child.
Can you talk to us about Mr. Rogers' legacy on the Rollins campus and really larger in Winter Park today?
Well, one day, Fred was coming to choir rehearsal, one of our student choir rehearsals, and then we were going to have lunch afterwards. Afterwards, he said, "Let me give you the tour of Rollins campus." And I said, "Well, this is great, Fred. I've only worked here 15 years. He said, "No, I want to show you my Rollins." So we walked around, and he pointed out things, how it was different. And then we walked down this long hallway, outdoor hallway on the other side of the campus. And there was a big sign, and he reached in his wallet and pulled out a picture of that sign. And it said, "Life is for service." He said, "I went by that every day. It still resonates with me." So I always question, there's how much, Rollins has certainly benefited from having this fabulously famous celebrity, but I always kind of wonder how much of Rollins was in Fred. Because he found home here, and his studies, he was a really good pianist, by the way. He had perfect pitch. I would invite him to hear things, and he always had very discerning ears. And I have a favorite story with that. One time we were having a Bach Festival rehearsal. He sang the Bach Festival when he was a student. And I handed him a score as a courtesy. He said, "Fred, as you listen tonight, if you hear anything, let me know." And, normally what you do is someone hands a score back at the end of the day and say, "Sure enjoyed it. Thanks for sharing it with me." Well, the next morning I got under my door the scores back with a list of things. "Your second bassoon player missed the E flat at measure 82. I mean, we're not talking a person without great musical ears. He had fabulous ears. And he was very discerning. And everything he ever mentioned to you was done with, almost as a teacher, always teaching you.
John, you're at Rollins College. Do the students there, do they understand, or are they aware of the contributions that Mr. Rogers made?
My first many years here, yes, they did. And as long as Fred was on TV, they grew up with him. Now they haven't. Now a lot of my students, though, know Daniel Tiger, an offshoot from his. My granddaughter watches Daniel Tiger, which is great fun. And so I think they recognize, and we in the Department of Music make sure our students know that legacy. The portrait of the college of Fred is in our building as you walk in. And when Fred was alive, he had a presence here. He would spend most of January here, and you'd see him in the building most days. And Joanne, his widow, lived a number of years beyond him, and she was always active with us. So I think they understand, but when you teach, it always is amazing to me how fast time goes. For example, when I first started teaching, the Vietnam War was fresh. Now it's ancient history to these students. It's historical. The only person who might have been involved in it was their grandparents. So time has passed since Fred's passing, but I think the statue, the beautiful statue in the middle of the campus, is a reminder. And we're really proud that he's a musician and a music alum. And we oftentimes talk about we're the department that carries the values of Fred.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, we want our students to be kind to each other, be civil, speak politely. The one thing about Fred is he worked really hard. Those scripts of his were every word crafted and thought through. And so you can be rigorous and kind at the same time. So we expect the best out of people, but we expect them to get there by being civil.
John Sinclair is a professor of music at Rollins College and a longtime friend of Fred Rogers. Coming up, everybody's favorite postman stops by. We'll talk with David Newell, Speedy McFeely of Mr. Rogers fame. You're listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE, and we're streaming live now on WMFE.org. You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. In the last segment, we were talking about the lasting legacy left behind by Fred Rogers, the pioneering children's television host. His teachings will be shared during Mr. Rogers' Week of Kindness, with multiple events being held around the Winter Park area next week. One of the speakers will be David Newell, mailman Speedy McFeely on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he charmed children with his regular appearances and jovial interactions with the show's host and his catchphrase,
"If there's anything you want, if there's anything you need, McFeely's Delivery brings it to you here with speed. Yes, our speedy delivery is a speedy delivery. Speedy delivery to you. Speedy delivery, Mary Maggie. Speedy delivery, bye-bye.
Speedy delivery to you."
Newell joined us ahead of his appearance at a Q&A at the Winter Park Library next Wednesday, and he started the conversation by explaining how he became involved with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
My first job on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was to be in charge of the props and costumes and just everything. You know, in PBS you do a lot of jobs, but when I first had the interview with Fred Rogers, I had never met him. I knew who he was, and I went in and I talked to him for a whole hour before he said anything about the job. And then he said, told me what he'd like me to do. But that's Fred. He was interviewing me without interviewing me, finding out who I was and so forth. At the end of our conversation, he said, "Well, when can you start?" That was how I got the job. And I said, "I can start today." And he said, "Well, no, take some scripts home, read them, and come back in for a production meeting next week. And he said, oh, by the way, before you go, I want you to play a part on the show. I'm writing in a delivery man, and I want you to play that part. He didn't audition me or anything. I became Mr. McFeely as I walked out the interview. So that's how it became. But McFeely's name was not McFeely in the initial scripts. It was McCurdy. And Fred Rogers was naming the delivery man McCurdy in honor of the Sears Roebuck Foundation, who gave the money to start our program and did for many years afterwards. And he was honoring him. But just before we started taping that first day, the phone rang for Fred. It was Sears Roebuck Foundation. They were calling to say thank you, and we love the concept, but please don't call the delivery man Mr. McCurdy. It may be too self-serving. So Fred came back to the studio. I could tell he was anxious about something. He said, we have to get you a new name. And before he finished that sentence, he said, McFeely, that's who you are. You're Mr. McFeely. And that's his middle name, Fred McFeely Rogers. So that's a long-winded way of telling you how I got the name.
At what point did you realize you were not just involved with a regionally produced children's show, that this was more of a cultural phenomenon?
You know, it took a few years. But I think the first time that I realized it, and it was really more, Fred, we were in New York City one day for an event, and the tourists who were around there just clamored, come running after Fred and wanting an autograph, and it was really something. And that's what I knew. Well, boy, this is different. I didn't expect this. I didn't realize it because you think you're doing a program for four walls when you're taping. You know, in the studio, we don't have an audience, just the crew and staff. And then we got out into the public, and boy, it was eye-opening. And from that point on, it's been a wonderful ride. And knowing that I'm affiliated with a program that is doing so much good, I think. And Fred Rogers wanted to make a program that would help children and families. And that's what he did. And that was his mission, to create as best of a program that he could for young children. He had a degree in music, and he had a degree in child development and a degree in theology, and all those disciplines worked together when he wrote scripts for the neighborhood. He wrote all of his own material, too. All the scripts and songs that were on the program, Fred wrote.
Without getting political or contentious, Mr. Rogers was really emphasizing diversity, equity, inclusion issues before DEI was really a thing.
Oh, yes. And that didn't come, that had no political implications whatsoever. But what it had was he studied child development and the diversity. He learned that each person is different and unique. And that's where all of that came from in his studies of child development. He was, I think, one of the pioneers of including a lot of that social emotional intelligence, if that's what you want to call it, in a children's program. At the same time, one of his professors said, yes, that's all very good, Fred, when you're writing these very important topics about, we did a week on divorce and a week on separation and a week on going to school. But his advisor said, but don't forget the fun. You know, you can get all of the important topics in, but don't forget the fun too. You have to have a mix. And Fred never forgot that. And a lot of the program has a lot of whimsy to it, the puppets. And what he loved the most, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but we did these little Mr. Rogers neighborhood operas. They were little musicals that the puppets would put together along with the cast, and it would culminate on a Friday. And Fred loved doing that. The whole week would build up to doing this little show with the puppets and the cast. And he loved writing the music for those little operas. And that's what he loved that more than he did being on camera. He never liked the on-camera part of it. He loved the creating of the scripts. He loved the creating of the music, composing the music, and he loved writing the scripts and all of the ideas that he would put into the scripts. But when he had to perform it, that was not his favorite thing to do, but he did it well. But he didn't like being a public figure. And going back to your question about when did you realize, when we were in New York that one time, he realized then that he was a public figure when the impact of television, what television can do, he dealt with that a lot. He would have preferred being on the radio. He, in fact, when the program ended, he said, you know, what I like to do now is to do some children's programming on a radio. And he never had a chance to do that, but that's what he would have loved to do. And I think he would have done something with the new technique as it was growing. He would have done something with audio. I know, story for children on audio somehow, but that was not to be.
Is there a story you can share about maybe someone notable that you really have a good memory of, and why?
Oh, yes. I think you know The Wizard of Oz, right? The movie. Mm-hmm. And adults to this day even say, boy, that witch on the program scares me. I can't watch that until that witch is gone, or something like that. And those flying monkeys. Well, I told Fred about these stories, and he said, I said, do you think we could ever do something about those scary images the children see on TV, especially the witch? And the name of the actress who played the witch in the movie is Margaret Hamilton. And Fred said, well, if you can find Margaret Hamilton, the actress, I'll write the scripts. And I did find Margaret Hamilton. She was touring in a musical. I contacted her agent and told the agent about everything, and he called back almost an hour later and said, Maggie, he called her Maggie, would love to do it. She watches the program with her grandchildren. She'd love to come on and talk about her role as the witch, because she was always getting stories how that her character would scare children. She never liked that. So she came on and talked about how she's an actress, came on in her civilian clothes, and we had a costume there that looked like the one she used in the movie, and she explained as pretend. And I hope we took the scariness out of that particular character, that scary image of a witch that she portrayed. And I think that was one of my favorite episodes, because we spent a couple days with Margaret Hamilton. She was delightful, and she would sit down at lunch when we had breaks and tell us all about her years at MGM and all of the shows that she did. She was in countless movies and knew everybody, and all these stories. Is fascinating. And she became a good friend. In fact, when we have 3 children, and they're all adults now, but when our son was born, the middle child, Maggie, found out about it and called and said, you know, you picked me up at the Pittsburgh airport. I want to come and see your new son. Wow. And I did. And we stopped at the station to say hello to Fred, and I took her home, and she spent about a couple hours holding our son in our living room. And the phone rang, and it was our neighbor. And our neighbor said, did I just see the Wicked Witch of the West walk into your kitchen? And yes, you did. And so then she flew back that evening. But she was a delightful person. And that, I think, of all the experiences I had working on the neighborhood, was working with Margaret Hamilton.
That was David Newell, mailman, Mr. McFeely from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And we'll have links to the Mr. Rogers Week of Kindness on our website, WMFE.org.
It's such a good feeling to know you're alive. It's such a happy...
That is all for today's edition of Engage. We'll be back Tuesday at 3. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.
New day. It's such a good feeling. Very good feeling. The feeling you know that I'll be back when the week is new, and I'll have